Hey everybody, how you guys doing? Hope you guys are doing okay. This is part 3 of the long discourses of the Buddha. This is the Potthapada Sutta, the States of Consciousness text. One of the longer philosophical talks, one of the dialogues in which the Buddha goes back and forth with other sages and philosophers about basic Buddhism and his thought. So, as all of these texts start, thus was heard, which is witness testimony. I was there, I heard this sort of thing, especially in an oral culture that's turning into a literate culture. You would have to say, no, I was there, I heard it, and somebody wrote down that somebody was there, as you hear in religious texts all the time. The Buddha was staying in Savatthi with his wealthy follower, I will mangle the names, unfortunately, some of them, Anantapindika, whose name means gives charity to the poor, possibly because of this story, where he sought the wanderer Potthapada, Clayfoot. Notice Pottha and Pada, and how much that is part of the Indo-European language family with Clayfoot, at the debate hall in the park of Queen Malika. Potthapada, who is presented as, I mentioned in the first one of these of the long discourses, that Potthapada is a sage who is presented as being like all of his followers, such that at first, when the king, in I believe the second of the long, maybe it was the second of the long discourses, the king can't tell which one is the Buddha because they're all quiet and sitting there quietly. In this, the Buddha himself walks up, and there's a mirroring clearly in these texts gathered closely together. This is the 9th of them. We have gone from the first to the second. Now the third one we will study is the 9th, skipping over a few. And this one clearly has a mirror with the second text, which is that you can see the Buddha himself, like the king, can't tell the difference between the leader and the followers, but not because they're all quiet, because they're all loud. So Potthapada was sitting with 300 wanderers, much like the Buddha was sitting with hundreds of followers, loudly debating, though, not quietly sitting, in all sorts of unclear ways. We're told they're unclear, muddy, random ways, about kings, robbers, wars, beds, villages, cities, gossip at the well, and the word on the street, which the text translates into English, the translations I've studied, and that it looks like is gossip at the well and word on the street, which is, yeah, the best translation I saw, which is nice, and in sort of common expressions, much like we would use today, I suppose, and much of the being and non-being, and much of being and non-being. Well, being and non-being are two things that the Buddha and other Indian and Greek and Chinese philosophers talk a lot about. Being, like substance, like stuff, and then non-being. When talking about Parmenides, how can being and non-being both coexist in any kind of way? And people talk about substance and absence and presence and all of that a lot on many different sides of philosophy today, after all of this time, in many interesting ways. All of this reveals about ancient and modern thought, all of it. So when Potthapada, who is arguing, he sees the Buddha coming, and he tells his followers to be quiet. Shh, okay guys, hey, the Buddha's coming. Hey, shh, be quiet. Because the Buddha likes it that way, he tells them, because Buddha really likes it when it's quiet. And that if they are quiet, he will want to talk to them. You know, hey guys, shh, hey everybody, hey, 300 guys, quiet down, this guy's coming here. This guy likes it quiet, and hey, if we're really quiet, we'll get him to tell us all of his fancy stuff here, okay guys? This will be great. You definitely get the edge here, especially with what follows. That Potthapada, especially because he's loud and cantankerous with everybody, he is making fun of slightly and setting up kind of a trap and an argument for the Buddha, one that the Buddha definitely deals with well in the text, and it's kind of questionable how much Potthapada comes off as bad and or equal to the Buddha, but opposite in strange ways in the text. Definitely he seems to be presented as inferior, but strangely he's a very different sage, and yet he seems to be someone the Buddha, well, you can judge for yourself. But he sets the Buddha up here to mock him and quiet down his whole crowd and say, all right, we're going to talk to the Buddha here. He likes it quiet, guys. And he moves out of the way and says, "Here, take my seat. Take the revered seat here. You be the champ here. Why don't you take the head seat?" Which, giving somebody the head seat in a classroom or in a debate hall is certainly symbolic. No, let me give you. And there is, I believe, there's a Taoist text that says the kind of person you really want to be is the kind of person who would give your enemy your best weapon and say, "No, here, have it. Go for it." He moves out of the way, says, no, take my revered, proud position. Clearly, Potthapada is not worried about pride and wants to just be kind of a jerk to people. So he's very much kind of like a Taoist of China. And the Buddha is very much not, which makes Zen a very interesting wedding of Taoism and Buddhism in later China. So Potthapada, who's definitely a sarcastic sage, is like, no, you take the proud seat. You take the high seat. Please, buddy. Yeah, you like it quiet. Shh, we're all going to be quiet, okay? All right. You can definitely tell there's some humor, it would seem, here. And they're going to kind of battle it out as the sage masters of different schools. Potthapada thanks the revered sage, again, possibly, we're all human beings. If he's thanking him a bunch, and then what follows, it's like, yeah, this is all sincere. Potthapada thanks the revered sage for going so far out of his way to visit them and clears him a seat, taking a low stool to the side for himself. Potthapada seems to mock the Buddha's restraint and clarity, and the Buddha asks what were they talking about. And Potthapada says it's not important and it'll be easy to speak of later. It's much like an airplane. It's like, well, a hospital, what is it? It's a large building with patients, but that's not important right now. It's like, no, all that mistaken nonsense we were talking about, all that foolishness, no. You don't understand, Shirley. That's not important right now. You're the Buddha, man. You're a great guy. So we're just, all that nonsense with all the, no. All that's just, you know what I mean. We just chatter and chatter and chatter. So you though, you know what I mean. Like, we definitely get that Potthapada is being either insincere or tricky, depending on how you want to read. It may be the same, in different words. So Potthapada says that those who debate in this hall, where we are, you know what I mean, he says it'll be easy to speak of all that stuff later, which definitely implies, no, we have an easy time of that whole muddle. We don't mind that it's all muddled. It seems like sort of a weird school of Heraclitean, Nietzschean, somewhat Taoistic, kind of anarchistic people. And there's other sages at the time who more want to live like dogs and other such things, like Diogenes in Greece. This is not exactly one of them, but seems of the rougher type. I want a rough tangle here. More than Buddhist restraint and clarity, so simply. Perhaps it remained a philosophy and did not become a major religion. The ways that Platonism and Aristotelianism fed into Christianity also, and the ways that Indian thought like this fed into Buddhism, and Buddha then going on to lead a major religion. So Potthapada says, in this debate hall, we talk about how higher consciousness and extinction of the self happen, which is very Buddhist, is how do you reach a higher state of consciousness, or how do you improve yourself such that you are more aware and more full of thought and wisdom and life and mental, physical power, one could say in many ways at this time. And extinction of the self, which is putting the self in check, or extinction of the self even more radically, which is very Buddhist and Jain-like language, although more Buddhist than Jain even. He says, but they disagree about whether, and he seems to be talking about, he's saying his own school is disagreeing? Or is he saying you and I? Because it seems jokey, like, no, there's just disagreement here. Knowing probably tricky, he's talking to the Buddha in very Buddhese language. He is talking very much Buddhism. So, no, there's just debates about how all of this happens. And of course, he's a rough guy. There's a bunch of people talking a bunch of stuff. So it seems like we're being set up actually here in the Buddhist context. We're having the Buddha come who likes people to sit quietly, and eventually, perhaps this is early on enough, but in later texts, the Buddha is definitely telling people to join monasteries and have a quiet monastic life. In this text, we definitely see somebody who's not so monastic, who's saying, well, there's a bunch of opinions about all that, how to put yourself in check. These are kind of more Dada artists being like, there's a whole program of all that, I get it. It seems. He seems the type. So he says, we all say, there's extinction of the self, that you become part of something larger than yourself and you really expand your mind and figure it out more, see more, however one wants to call all of this in ancient or modern terms. But we disagree, there are disagreements here, about whether perception of the self, powerful priests, or the gods make it happen. Which sounds like he's describing all of India, kind of, and the golden age of Indian philosophy. So he asks Buddha, how does higher consciousness happen? Which is a good straight question to have the Buddha. And think about what a great text it is to have a revered sage, but opposite the Buddha, who is presenting us with a kind of a powerful, chaotic, kind of Taoistic, but Indian sage, and that he is going to have a similar position, but he is putting this straight to the Buddha. And this is a great kind of routine. This is good. Of course, he's shaking the Buddha, and he's like, yeah, it's a bunch of stuff, and I'm tricking you out and stuff. So, consciousness, what's up? You definitely get that there's a move here, and it's a good, tricky move. You're like, oh, I'm dancing around, I'm moving, I'm shaking in my argument. By the way, are you guilty? Just straight, and then just suddenly order in the court. Are you guilty? Did you order the code red? After you've bantered around, I'm just a simple country lawyer. I don't understand procedure entirely. And then it's like, did you? There's a similar sort of routine kind of going on here, isn't there? So how does higher consciousness happen? How do you get enlightened? What's going on with that? So we all think that there's wisdom and enlightenment and you become more so seeing and wise. And something has to do with the self and extinction, like the blowing out of a candle, but what is that entirely? So what is all of that and how does that happen? And he's just now squared himself after mocking the Buddha and dancing around. He's put him in the seat. And now he has shot at him the direct question, which is a great setup. It's a wonderful, simple text as it's already unfolded. The Buddha says, and this is the spot where the Buddha is going to get to preach Buddhism and basic Buddhist doctrine and basic Buddhist texts at people as fundamental religious holy texts and philosophy texts. The Buddha says that perceptions are caused and trained, can cause or prevent them. The wise model and embody this training of the mind and whole self to be tranquil and unified, which is not Potthapada and his followers. They are not tranquil. Tranquility is a major human sort of thing. There are basic human emotions. A lot of times we feel good about things, a lot of times we feel bad about things, a lot of times we feel tense about things, and a lot of times we feel calm about things. And there's a lot of Indian and Greek philosophers who believe not in, yay, thrilling, they believe in tranquility. And tranquility is very much the emotional kind of state. I'm not saying anything else about enlightenment, but a lot of what it is felt or imagined to be, and there's Zen tricks about how it is and isn't this, and there's many Buddhist discussions about who is and isn't a good Buddhist and why. But there is a lot of similarity in Indian and Greek thought and Chinese thought about tranquility, and there is a lot in Indian and Greek thought where if they catch you getting shaken, and there's good stuff about this in Stoicism that matches Taoism and Buddhism a lot, even though Stoicism is not completely Taoism or Buddhism at all. That there's a lot about that if people are tranquil, not excited, thrilled, yeah. Potthapada seems more of a thrill guy. He seems more into the rocking of it, and he seems more kind of Nietzsche, and he seems more kind of like, yeah, we're going to have thrilling change, and we're going to have good, but it's going to be exciting good. There are a lot of thinkers more like Buddha, and you can ask yourself whether the Zen people completely agree with the Buddha or whether they say they are being truly Buddha. The Buddha himself in this text is presented as somewhat anti-Taoist, which he would not have known of at the time unless he isn't, omniscient in the ways of the Buddha, and that gets canonical and esoteric. But he seems to be facing down a very Diogenes from Greece, Taoist from China guy, Zhuangzi or otherwise, and he is saying, no, there's tranquility and unity, and you want to calm yourself and you want to unify yourself, which seems different from Potthapada, because Potthapada wants disunity somewhat. He seems to want not necessarily complete disunity because he's hanging out in this debate hall of his, whether it's his or not, or anybody's, because they're all just fighting all the time, and it's easy. So obviously there need be not much order, as we see, which is kind of brilliant later in the text. So basically, Buddha wants tranquility like a Stoic, or even Taoists, as much as Taoists like flipping people off and like robbing the rich to feed the poor, and doing all sorts of crazy things to people, which is all sorts of Star Wars and all sorts of amazingness we'll talk about in later lectures here, because I'll be doing a good lecture, or 2 or 3, about Taoism, which should be good. That this here seems like a more rough and ready sage who wants to party and battle, which is a bit more Taoist, although they also value tranquility, which is something like goodness and calm, not goodness and excitement, not exciting, tense good, but the opposite, calm good. I guess calm bad, of course, is depression. This is a bit of Eeyore, Tigger. I am more the Tigger, so I am more the Potthapada. But again, there is more, I guess Pooh Bear is more the Buddha, and then you have Piglet, who is sad and tense, like Rabbit also. It gets complicated. But yes, there is definitely seemingly the 4 personalities people identify with, sort of Pooh. And yes, Pooh, happy and calm. Piglet, tense and sad. Tigger, happy and tense. And you would have Eeyore be sad and calm, which is depressed. Personality types, those are simplistic, but there are basic sorts of humors and emotions people did believe in, and then is somewhat true in human behavior, and probably things children are seeing in people and understanding in all kinds of ways. Tranquility and calm, it is interesting to ask, how much do we want tranquility and calm, and how much do we want happy calm versus happy excited, and how, you know? I think I drank too much coffee today, for instance. So we have here that the Buddha says, well, because you can train your perceptions to be calm, tranquil, and unified, and thus they're sort of happy. Buddhism usually aims for something like somewhat calmly happy, and then thus open and thus enlightened, whatever, and again, that proceedingly is. So remaining in delight and detachment while engaging with the world, the enlightened pass from one stage to the next while remaining fully at each stage, aware of each and then the next together as a unified whole. The one who sees and understands there is no need for self and other embraces and rids themselves of self and other, which oddly sounds like Buddha is a sort of negative Hegelian here. That there are many stages of passing through in self and other. This actually itself is very kind of Nietzsche versus Hegel, a little bit, because it is Nietzsche and all chaos being like, well, why can't we be a dancing star, you know, and all like rock out together and have a bunch of different opinions and just fight, rah, rah, rah. And the Buddha says because we need to go through sort of an inner Hegelian process of sorts. It would seem, here the Buddha seems to be saying that there are particular stages and that one should go through these particular stages one to the other. Or perhaps we could also read this to say that you're going from one state whole to another state and situation, like walking from one room into another and forgetting what you were doing in the last room. And it's not actually that you go from one stage to another and it's building into something by stage, but that you're just going from one situation to another and maintaining clarity and realizing where you came from and where you're going next with more awareness, which wouldn't actually make it so Hegelian. It wouldn't make it that you're going through a stage-by-stage psychological process, not so much a historical one, not so Hegel, but an inner kind of process of alchemy or stages. This could also mean, though, more roughly, that the Buddha is saying, well, you could be rough and tumble, you could argue with everybody, a la Nietzsche, but it would really be good to just have a clear, quiet conversation, and then go on to the next one and the next situation, and then sit quietly and meditate, and then understand you're having a conversation after that, and slowly be aware of all of this altogether. That could be what the Buddha is saying, but here it certainly would be read by many Buddhists that the Buddha is saying there are particular stages, and then there will be many doctrinal schools of Buddhism which will believe in those sorts of stages. In fact, that sort of thing had gotten decently esoteric in China by the time that then Zen Buddhism came around, which can get esoteric, but is more famous for saying all that esotericism How about just a good old-fashioned Taoist slap in the face, which is not so many stages, just sudden enlightenment, which is part of Zen and part of kind of more Potthapada and certainly highly, highly Taoist. Would be interesting, of course. I am sure Zen folks read this text, so it would be... I'm not aware of how much Zen folks mention Potthapada at all. I will double-check through my stuff before getting into the lectures on Zen, and there will be quite a few of those coming up after Taoism, because you have to cover Taoism first before covering Zen. There's just no way around it. At least there shouldn't be. But of course, there's a way around anything, including the self, which is wisdom, yes, as we know. And now we are fully enlightened. So, the one who sees and understands there is no need for self and other embraces and rids themselves of self and other. Whether or not that's concrete stages of many in particular. So Buddha asks what Potthapada thinks and whether he has heard of this before. And Potthapada says he hasn't, and asks if all of this is one or many. Which sounds like, okay, so you're running a game on me in a system. Well, a guy like Potthapada probably would not like so much of a philosophical system if he's a bit Nietzschean. So he's like, okay, so we're talking one unified thing, or are we talking a couple different parts? Which is how I would definitely, one of the ways I would feel somebody out. If somebody told me, no, I have a whole coherent system for this, definitely one of the questions one might ask is, so there's a whole underlying structure, what's it made of? Or, okay, how many different components from where are we talking if there isn't an underlying unified complete structure or practice? That's a good way of trying to get to somebody saying they simply know something altogether, which sounds like the Buddha's putting forward here. Sounds like he's saying he has a special method, maybe? Or at least that sounds like what Potthapada is thinking he's saying. So he says, okay, we're talking one structure to your practices or many here. Like, what are we talking about? Good philosophical question to get into with being and non-being and one and manyness. Very ancient stuff. Buddha says he teaches that it is both one and many, one as all and each as many, which is a very Buddhist answer. You might find it frustrating, but the Buddha tends to take all sides of everything and then suggest that is sort of the uber way out, and not even then taking the side of all versus none, and he gets tricky with it, leading people in and out of each and every sort of side of things, which is either very useful or very useless, depending on, well, there are some people who think it's very useless, but there's a whole lot of people who think that thing is kind of useful, which is why Potthapada, as a more chaotic guy, like my cat walking behind the camera right now, that basically that he's a more chaotic guy. So he's going to test the Buddha and try to figure out, okay, so what sort of monastic enlightenment are we talking about? If you wind up to an artist, of a more countercultural persuasion, you said, oh, I have a method of Buddhist enlightenment. The first question is, okay, how many of them you got, pal? Is one of the questions I might ask. Although I'm not the performance artist, as my high wire cat is. And yes. How you doing, pal? Yes. Anywho's. You can see the edge of him right there. I'm not going to move the camera around. You can see his tail. Yes, in action. So, let's get back to Potthapada here for a second, though. Just a second, and then back to the cats. So, the Buddha says, well, I'm on the side of both one and many. Potthapada asks if knowledge comes before or after perception, which is a really good philosophical question because that does sound a lot like empiricism versus rationalism. Or rationalism versus empiricism, which these positions are very based in Greek and Indian philosophers who are somewhat similar in Aristotle and Gautama and others, who are saying things like, okay, there's perception and then there's reason, what's the relationship between them, and are more rationalists in Europe, like Descartes or Kant, would say, well, there's forms of reason and then there's learning about things, and a more empiricist guy like Hume or Locke would, the smoke monster or the guy, I don't know how all that worked out, is basically going to say, well, no, it comes after. Like, you don't have forms first. You're a blank slate, a tabula rasa. It comes after. These are major battles in Islamic thought as well. You moving that light around, pal? I have a director of, I put some lights up there, and he's moving them around and helping stage direct at the moment. Yep, he's figuring it out. I got technical support. At least the most I've had so far during the pandemic, So, yeah, you have here that, and guess what answer Buddha's going to say. And so the Buddha says perception comes before knowledge, in fact. Doesn't take both sides. Potthapada, which means the Buddha is actually taking very much a more pragmatist and very much more an empiricist. Let's say empiricist first, pragmatist as the latter term. Seems to be taking that. The perception first and knowledge of any form is amassed out of perception. This is something where Buddha is very Hume. And Hume, I have read in a paper, I believe by Gopnik, is that the Philosophical Baby author, that, Hume was somewhat close to Jesuits who knew Tibetans or others, and there were routes into Europe of this kind of thing. However, as we can see in a lot of the ancient stuff I teach, human beings were communicating and having ideas in similar circumstances that do in modern Europe and then in ancient cultures take similar sorts of forms. Well, which one comes first? Not just chicken and egg, but do I see something and then learn what horses are, or is there some sort of form of the horse, or is there some sort of objective truth, or how do all of these things work back and forth? Some of these problems are very, not perennial necessarily, but they are recurrent because we are still human beings probably who drink water, count objects, which we may only have been doing a lot since literacy in city-states abouts. As well as have specialized tasks in which we need to be several chimpanzees carrying the log all together, if that's still a thing, in this economy. Potthapada is basically asking about empiricism and rationalism, and actually the Buddha seems to side with Potthapada and says, no, it is more empirical, and perception comes first, and then we learn about things after we have perceived things, which the Buddha also thinks we become attached to things and desire things based on our experience and how we get hooked up and hooked to things. Potthapada asks if self and perception are two things or one thing. And Buddha asks Potthapada if he believes there is a self, which is a tricky move. Potthapada says he thinks there is a crude self made out of the four elements. That would be earth, water, air, and fire. And then again, self and mind are for the Vaisheshika and others. And Buddha says, if so, if the self is made out of the four elements, then perception and self would have to be two different things, as the material self remains much the same as it perceives very different things. Which is, again, some tricky debating here. Potthapada says he thinks the mind makes the self, including all the organs and parts together, which means, in a certain sense, our physical selves are perceived by our minds, which either means that your perception of your stomach and your liver is all in your brain, or it means it's all in your soul, kind of in another realm of consciousness, and the physical reality is all an illusion, perhaps, a la Parmenides or Leibniz, or something like that. That mind creates body, which could mean, again, it's all a subjective dream that we're in the head. In the head, where's that, as the Buddhist Zen folks would say. There's a great Zen, I believe it is Hui Neng, who says that if there is a rock in your head, it must be terribly hard to pick your head up off the floor every morning. If all of objectivity is simply subjectively in your head must be a very, very heavy thing, man. That must be a heck of a task, having objectivity all to yourself, Humpty Dumpty, which is not entirely a thing, which is wonderful to observe whether you believe in objectivity, subjectivity, both, or neither, as the Catuskoti of Nagarjuna would tell you, the greatest of Buddhist logicians. So, Potthapada says he thinks the mind makes the self, and Buddha says that self and perception would still have to be different with such a view. Which sounds like the Buddha is realizing that Potthapada wants to say that it's just that because mind makes self, that's just all you perceive is self. And the Buddha is saying as long as you keep referring to self and perception as two things that are interrelated, you're not showing that they're one and the same like you want to. Seems to be what Buddha is saying here. And there may be some lost in context, but it does seem, and again I go with the translations of others and am not a translator, that it seems that the Buddha is, and then there are notes and suggestions and other things you can read in it as well, and I try to work that into my notes and lecture for you, that it seems that the Buddha is trying to lead Potthapada into the idea that the Buddha himself really sees that self is perception and constant reality better and can argue for it better than Potthapada himself can. Because remember, these seem to be similar thinkers. So the Buddha seems to be trying to trick Potthapada, not trick, but argue and debate Potthapada into a corner, saying, but your views are still dualistic, seems to be the suggestion. And I am overcoming the dualism, and you are not. With your skepticism that still has contradictions in your skepticism, because I have the super pragmatic skepticism that is both dogmatism, skepticism, everything and its mother. And so you're still being dualistic. Which, of course, this is a guy who's fighting everybody and fighting his fellow people, so he's rather dualistic. He's a dualist. He's dueling with other people, bang, bang, which is rather opposed and opposites. It all works out, yes, socially, or doesn't in Pottapada's case entirely. And yet it is still all good in the end, interestingly enough. So Potthapada says, if those with different views from the Buddha, such as himself, have trouble with this, so he still disagrees, can Buddha say that the world is eternal or not? Buddha says he doesn't say either way. Potthapada asks if self and body are one and the same thing, and Buddha says he doesn't say either way. Potthapada asks if the Buddha will exist after his death. And even though there's a lot of doctrinal Buddhists who would say yes, and Buddha is in Pure Land here and there and is all of this, the Buddha says he doesn't say either way, which doesn't mean he doesn't have an amazing afterlife. Potthapada asks why the Buddha doesn't say either way on these important questions, and Buddha says it is not helpful to people, does not lead to disenchantment, calm, or enlightenment. This is one of those points where Kalupahana, who was of University of Hawaii, that he basically says that the Buddha is a pragmatist because it is true that pragmatists and Wittgenstein, who I like, would say really a lot of it, and Buddha says a lot, that is, what is fruitful? What is true is what is fruitful. And a lot of people would say, but you don't want to just give people propaganda. No, you don't, because lies and propaganda is not simply fruitful. If you lie to everybody, I would, yes, play the North Korean potato song, but you can look up the North Korean potato song, which is amazing, on YouTube for yourself. Maybe I will post that next to the thing. It's a happy song. And I'm not saying anybody's completely lies, because actually a lot of times the lie is enough of the truth that it is also the lie, and that's how a lot of things in life work, and that's why a lot of things are hard to figure out. How the good is the bad is the good, and yet we are dualistic. And there is a fly buzzing around here. So yeah, the cats haven't found it yet, or which is good because it's over the camera equipment. So it is not fruitful and it is not helpful. There is a lot here, and many would say, oh, that's bad to not just tell people the truth. Well, actually, again, Buddha would say in many ways, if you're telling people the truth in ways that doesn't help them, you are not being very helpful. You are not actually being as truthful, whatever you think that is, from a more pragmatist angle. You're not really doing truth. You're doing what you want to do, kind of when, and you're telling you how you want to, would be an easy way of saying what it seems the Buddha would be about here. So, in a certain sense, there's a lot. This also matches, oddly enough, Confucius, who's not exactly a Buddhist at all. Confucius does not believe in meditating, thinks that is useless and a waste of time. Study, get a good job. Again, contribute to the family and community. But there are great lines of the Analects where Confucius says to people who ask him how to serve spirits and religious rituals, which he was in support of decently and pragmatically, thought it brought the community together, and was decently traditional, said, you don't know how to serve life. How are you going to know how to serve death? Like, you don't know how to feed living people, increasingly in tent cities, etc. How are you going to feed the dead? Let's worry about the living. And this doesn't mean, of course, there's many sort of a give to Caesar what is Caesar kind of moment here. It's not really there is or isn't. He didn't say there is or isn't the afterlife necessarily in that alone. It more is just, no, well, if you're taking care of people, probably the dead will be happier or something like that, because Confucius probably believed in dead spirits. So he's not saying, to heck with the dead, they don't count. He's saying, so you're worried about what to feed your dead spirits, and yet there's people starving. So probably the dead spirits are going to be upset or something like that, whether or not they get an orange, But yeah, that seems to be Confucius, and that seems to be a bit Buddha and a bit the pragmatism. So Potthapada says, so be it. And go do what you see needs doing. And the Buddha leaves. That's it. It's like there wasn't, and there's a lot of moments of Zen and other things where it's not that one wins, one loses. It's sort of like, there's a lot of moments where if neither necessarily loses, that actually means both kind of win in the Buddhist tradition, which is cool. Because if you have a more skeptical system, and neither one kind of screws up, which is getting shaken and being tense and being like, oh no, I screwed up. And that's the sign that somebody faltered or was egocentric or was dumb about something and ignorant and attached to a viewpoint. Ha, I shook you. That if basically it's like, okay, so be it. All right, you're cool. I'm cool. We're fools. That sort of suggests like they're two sages passing in the night and they're both acknowledging each other. There may even be, this guy could have become a major philosopher who had a major school, who had a text of a similar nature in different traditions, but actually tells the story in reverse order with different details, but I don't know of this text, and it may or may not have ever existed at all. But this is the kind of thing where this is a major philosopher who could have had the story from another way around. Possibly. There are things where sometimes one person says it or the other person says it in different versions of different texts of different schools of thought. So this guy did not win out like the Buddha did, but this text does seem to have him be somewhat of a winner. Not entirely, though. You can judge. He says, Potthapada says, so be it. So go do what you do. Yeah, you're good. And again, he likes to war with people. Hey, we came, we fought. Like, hey, I talked to Buddha. All right, hey, I'm a jerk. You're a jerk. Bye, jerk. You know what I mean? And you go do your thing. I'm going to stay here with these jerks. And Buddha leaves. The 300 wanderers, notice they're wanderers. They're kind of chaotic and not at home. The Buddha definitely wants you to somewhat dwell. And the wanderers are kind of chaotic, even though they're in their debate hall. They mock Potthapada from all sides. They're like, bah, ha, ha, which is totally Pottapada's kind of place, saying he let Buddha off easy, and they don't understand a word of what Buddha was talking about. Mocking Buddha, saying the world is eternal and the world is not eternal, which is very much objectivity and subjectivity, permanent truth, fixed structures of things such that there are fixed facts or truth or perspective, and then that there isn't, or that things are transitory or temporary perspective or facts, but then they change. Very much objective. Oh, the world is objective and subjective. Oh, the Buddha's amazing. Potthapada says he himself doesn't know if the world is eternal or not, which is the Buddha. He is in agreement. Again, this is a strange, opposite, parallel, bizarro world Buddha here, in a weird way, several that are clear in the text, and he's not a total loser in the battle. He says, I don't know either, like, if that is, whether the enlightened live after death, whether or not becoming a good, sagely person and gaining a lot of karma and merit and hopefully having a Hindu afterlife, if that's even a thing or not, or if the self lives after death. I don't know. But Buddha teaches a practice that seems sound and grounded. Why should he not be free to approve? He says, which is a good way of retorting it. It's basically, look, he came, he disagreed, he's got some of a thing, so I gave him some credit, and then I let him go. Why the heck shouldn't I do that? What are you guys going to say? Which is a very much what the leader of kind of the Nietzscheans here would say, is like, well, I don't care whether or not I let him off easy or not, but he seems all right. And like, we're all arguing, we don't like him, whatever, you know what I mean? Like, that's fine. So he's not presented as totally agreeing with the Buddha or converting, in fact. So later, Potthapada goes with Sutta, the son of an elephant trainer, to see Buddha and told him about the 300 wanderers. So Buddha says they are quite blind. Buddha tells Potthapada that Brahmins who say that after death there is complete happiness have never been completely happy anywhere for any length of time, or know how anyone could be completely happy here, which is hilarious. The Buddha is basically saying, look, People who believe in heaven, where have you ever seen them be happy anywhere for any length of time in a Denny's? Not at all, right? And he's just straight up saying this. He is not necessarily saying, because he is being uber agnostic. He's being a super skeptic here. He is saying, and he knows the dialectical moves here very, very much without knowing the word dialectic in the slightest, of course, is that he is saying that, well, all of these people who are so certain of heaven, not that there isn't a heaven, or isn't heavens or pure lands of Buddhism later, plenty, because there are people who have this text as sacred to them who then believe in many different heaven realms and pure lands, and this does not directly say there are not heavens, which there technically are many in a lot of ways for Buddhism. So, and systems of them, like Dante's hell, which he may have picked up from Marco Polo or from China or from something like that, because actually levels of hell is very Buddhist as well. Several hells, several heavens. So he's like, no, people who say that there's a perfect land where everybody's happy, yeah, it's very much like the Confucius, can you feed people? It's like, but at the same time, have you ever seen any of these guys be happy for 5 minutes? No. So, like, I'm not saying that they're not gonna be, but I mean, come on, who are we talking about here? Is his argument, which is perception leading to knowledge, actually. It is looking at examples, and the Buddha is very pragmatic and very much like Jesus and others who use parables and metaphors and analogies, which is Plato, Jesus, others, all sorts of folks from different cultures, the Hopi, all kinds of folks, is that you are teaching through analogy in order to teach through experience or example, and then that leads to knowledge, which is the form, if there is a form of knowledge there, which then would proceed rather empirically rather than rationally. So the folks, the Hindus, who seems to be the Buddha is saying Brahmins and Hindus, they are like a man who says that he will love the most beautiful woman in the world, but then when questioned has no idea what she might look like in the slightest, not the color of her hair, nor her caste, nor clan, which is important to tell your folks, which is stupid. This is great. It's like people who say, it's a beautiful analogy of the Buddha, is that people who say they know objective truth or total reality, anybody who says that they know the right way and other people who are on the other side of the debate or anything are not, that they have the objective, the other side is merely subjective, and they know the complete side of the thing. They're like somebody who says, I'm going to love the most amazing, sexy person alive, but by the way, I have no idea what that looks like, which is really funny from a modern philosophy perspective, because it basically means, no, people who tell you there's objective, completely positivist truth, they can't give you a single example of what completely pure truth would actually look like historically. They've never met it. It doesn't have hair, it doesn't have feelings, it doesn't have individuality, it doesn't have relationships. It's just the pure form of truth itself, or the pure method of science or something. But where is it historically? Where is it physically? And people who want pure objective truth, I would say, rather a la Nietzsche, which is a little bit Potthapada, if you want pure truth from religion, science, politics, anything, no matter how powerful or strong technology and forms of life is, where would you find, the complete thing historically? Well, no one has met this amazing woman who is perfect just yet, in the flesh, as it were. Notice the woman is the flesh, is the earthly, is the material here in the example, which is quite gendered and quite clearly putting the lower, and the higher is some imaginary male thing that may or may not exist. So because Buddha is, yes, of a Wiccan coven. I am in Berkeley land. So yes, I don't believe he is in a coven of Wiccans, but perhaps we all are in the spirit of the Buddha. Yes, or the the wisdom and openness and mindfulness rather than ego of all of this. So Brahmins, he says, who say after death the self will be free from disease, are like building a staircase for a palace without knowing which direction it will face or how tall it will be. Buddha tells Potthapada there are 3 kinds of self we gather: the material self, the mental self, and the formless self, perception itself, and there are ways of getting rid of all 3. This is like not knowing which way the palace will face or how tall it will be, and building the staircase underneath the palace so it will reach it no matter how things are. This suggests we are also underneath and building upwards towards the formless. What this seems to mean, and this is a confusing metaphor, but going to Wittgenstein it does, which I would do, a la Kalupahana, Sluga, and other people who I follow and like, is that you have here that the mind and thought will be anything it is. If you are paying attention to your emotions, you're your emotions also. If you're your words, you're your words. Whatever is going on in the mind is what's going on. So rather than build something fixed in words or emotions or perception or reason, what you should do is build up your instincts so that you're ready to think using any of the parts at all. Is definitely the way that more pragmatic readings like my own would read this. That what the Buddha is saying about the building complicatedly is that you don't need to build it a particular way if you are always rebuilding the building of your mind. You don't need to base it on a particular thing other than your kind of underlying consciousness and clear awareness. If you build it not on a particular element of consciousness, but in a certain sense on the openness of consciousness itself as the supporting superstructure of awareness, then any of the ways you talk or feel or perceive with your eyes or your ears will all be more clear and all be more clearly interwoven together, such that there isn't really a particular basis at all, is the tricky thing he is saying here. But this actually fits Wittgenstein very much in what I believe. Wittgenstein would say a lot about semantics and meaning and truth and fact and everything in life, is that actually when you want to boil fact or meaning down to just the words, just the facts, ma'am, it just doesn't, the material ma'am, yes, of us all, as we're talking here. It doesn't entirely boil down to just what we want or just what was said or just what the physical arrangement was exactly that we know perfectly. It is more of an interweaving practice of life, which is what a lot of Buddhism suggests and others say, like myself, is interrelated with Wittgenstein and a lot of pragmatism and modern thought. And when the Buddha says there's ways of getting rid of all three, when he says that, he seems to be saying, so you have a bunch of different sorts of mentality built up in you and in your eyes and in your ears and in your mind and in your feelings and in your words, maybe your verbal practices. That's the way I tend to interpret this. This isn't exactly what he's saying, but he does say interesting ways of picking apart the mind in similar forms in other Buddhist texts like this, picking apart the different forms of mind and levels, which do and don't match up with our understandings today in ways that when you clear out all of these kinds of things, it would be something like, well, focus on clearing out your eyes. Well, focus on clearing out your ears. Well, focus on clearing out kind of your sense of touch and taste. It would be something like that with all the different forms of yourself and body. The Buddhists talk like you have a material body, a this body, a that body. They also talk about that all of these things are built up mentally, physically as piles in us. So you're trying to empty out all of those piles. And if we are very much awareness, then the ways that you are verbally bound up, emotionally bound up, perceptively bound up, imaginatively bound up, musically, but like anything you like, although I would just simply boil it down to a few components just for ease of talk, but then anything under the sun, anywhere where you're bound up, which often would be something like verbally, mentally, physically, yada yada, clear each of those things out, which is understanding that actually you can pivot and include or not any of these things, because that's not what's important overall. That does seem to be overall what formlessness beneath each of the kinds of building ups of forms, and then you empty each of these out. Sutta, the son of the elephant trainer, not Potthapada, but the other guy who comes with Potthapada but is Pottapada's junior and follower, asked Buddha if, although they're contentious followers, so how much do any of these guys follow each other in the slightest? Well, Sutta and him got here together somehow. I don't know who walked in front of the other. That asked Buddha if the material self truly exists apart from the others. And Buddha says that when there is one, there isn't the others. Much as Sutta himself did exist in the past, but not truly and exclusively, such that he isn't also with them now. Or that if he is with them now, he didn't truly have a gathered self in the past. Each self is the true self at the time, as it is. Milk becomes curds, curds become butter, butter becomes ghee, and ghee becomes cream of ghee, which you can get at Trader Joe's, I hope. But milk isn't curds or butter or ghee. But they're different and they're the same. Buddha tells Sutta that the sorts of selves are merely names, which is a little bit pragmatic, a little bit. Wittgenstein says names and words are names are merely labels that we stick on things in ways. that these sorts of selves are merely names, expressions and figures of speech commonly used in the world, which the Buddha himself uses without misperceiving them, which suggests, I don't mean, I'm telling it like it is, how it sounds. I'm telling you how it really is. And I know that I'm using figures of speech, so don't take me too literally. As Zhuangzi says, the Taoist of China, I'm going to use rough words and I want you to listen to them roughly. How will that be? And yes, the Potthapada becomes a follower of sorts, but so he does actually in the end convert, which happens at the very end of the text. I have to say, I have the suspicion this might be tacked on by later generations. There are ways where the end of the text sometimes says, and suddenly there's a weird plot twist at the very end, and then this, which could be lines tacked on at the end. Potthapada seems to hold his own throughout the whole thing and is letting the Buddha go his own way. Now we have this part at the end where Potthapada suddenly comes with his followers like, hey, buddy, oh yeah, we're both... But Potthapada becomes a lay follower, a common person, but Sutta becomes a monk and goes on to become a revered Buddha himself. On the website, I have a statue of the guy, which is quite large. He is the son of an elephant trainer, which is rather symbolic. So actually, Potthapada, I would say, and this is following other scholars who study these texts, and I've followed their work, seems like this end this could be very well tacked on at the end. There's what may have happened is the original text has Potthapada, the Buddha leaves. He's like, hey, buddy, it seems like a cool ending at the end, right when the Buddha leaves. And Potthapada basically says, hey, and he stays with his people, and he says, but what the heck do you jerks know? Seems like a great end. Then all of a sudden at the end we have here tacked on, oh, but by the way, he and Sita the lower guy come and they both convert, but by the way, Sita the lower guy is actually outranks his own teacher before. It could totally be the original text just in the version. It also could be you have the original story, and then by later Buddhist generations, which happens with especially ancient texts, other stuff is addendumed that happens to tell more of the story, and guess what? It happens to be a bit more favorable to whoever is telling the history in the books, and writing the history books, of course. And religious texts were the science, history, philosophy books of their time, of their cultures, very, very much before things were, well, as they were specializing since ancient Egypt, but not as specialized and with as much technology and types of texts as we have today. Each self is the true self at the time as it is. A lot of these things may seem rather mystical. It's always good to try to pragmatically talk this out and say, now what's going on here? It's quite an ingenious idea for the Buddha to say, does the material self truly exist apart from the others? Which is a kind of an interesting thing. So let me explain it this way as far as I understand it. And then the Buddha says that it is whatever it is at the time, like milk is then ghee is then cream. So let's say that I focus on myself as a material person. So let's say that I'm like feeling my body and I'm like looking with my eyes at the camera and at the screen, and I'm feeling very corporeal right now. And let's say I don't know entirely what that is, but I feel very much in my body at the moment. Then let's say I go deep in my mind and I start to think about Buddhism. Now, which is my real self in my experience? Well, when my brain and body are kicking and I'm feeling my muscles and I'm feeling all of this, still don't know anybody who knows, is there consciousness in here, or is all the consciousness in here? So if I'm dancing around, if I'm feeling really conscious and alive in all of these cells and all of me, that's different from me spacing out and thinking, well, I'm arguing with the Buddha himself about whether or not this or that. I'm saying, well, what is the Buddha saying here exactly? So which is my real self? Well, when I'm out in the world dancing, I'm feeling and am a real self this way. And when I'm deep in my mind thinking about and debating, the Buddha or your great aunt Susan, is that you are whatever you are at the moment. So you are, of course, sort of physically there when you're not paying attention to yourself physically there. But the Buddha is taking a decently subjective tack here, and he is kind of saying your mind, life is but a dream, as Lewis Carroll says in the beginning of Alice. That you are what you eat, you are as you perceive. Again, perception comes first, knowledge and form, in a sense, comes after. With our mind, we make the world, as the Buddha says in the Dhammapada. What that means is, when I'm in my mind as my imaginary self, I am my imaginary self. It is really awesome that the Buddha then follows that up with saying, but not only with the stages of dairy products here, not entirely vegan, yes, maybe they're all almond-based cream of ghee, yes, now at, I'm not going to keep plugging a store chain, that if I ask you, and this is exactly the sort of games I like to play with philosophy, if I ask you, okay, so you were yourself 20 years ago, right? And you say yes. And I say, some of my students weren't. If I say, all right, so you were the person you were 10 years ago, right? So you were that, but now you're you. Now, which are you? Now, you would have to say, well, I mean, I sort of was that, and now I'm me. And if I say, well, but in 7 years, you've changed your mind and your body and all your cells and all of these things have changed out. So if that's true, and the skeptical answer here is you don't have to pick. You are and are not yourself, as the Buddha says, and Heraclitus says. You are both, so you don't have to pick a side here. And if people are trying to trick you into picking a side, you can say, no, I am or I'm not, or you can be all zen and just flip that around any way you please, and it does not matter if people know. But the interesting thing is, if you ask people to pick, okay, so as you mentally, remember the last example I used, as you mentally think about yourself in the past, and you're like, I'm me, officer, and in the court of law, I tell the judge, no, I was there on the corner, and then I did this. Now, if a lawyer, I'm just a simple country lawyer, I haven't taken hemlock yet, and I tell you, now listen, is you now, or is you then? Yes? You might get confused, but the thing is, you're you then when you think I'm me then, because that's how we mentally experience it. I'm like, well, I'm going to be the guy next Tuesday who's next Tuesday, so I'm that guy right now as I'm thinking I'm my own possibility next Tuesday. That's how a lot of times in the world I'm thinking about my possibilities, projecting them into the future. In that time, I am futural or what have you. We're not going to get all Heideggerian on this. I am simply sort of whatever the arrangement of me imagining myself in the future is, rather than feeling myself wave my arms all around, is that would be me, or a way that I'm me when I'm in my head thinking about myself. Whether or not I'm walking down the street, whether or not I'm paying more or less attention to my shoelaces, I'm me to that extent. So what's actually going on here, which you can read into the text not so difficultly, with not much difficulty, even though speech is the hardest of things, as Harjadef of ancient Egypt said, the hardest of all things, as we can see, or hear rather, is that essentially you are yourself in the past as you imagine yourself as a past thing. That's you in the past because that's how you talk about it and that's how you are. But at the same time, in a very physical, mental, different way, I now pull you back to yourself, which is very Buddhist, and I say, but you are the creature who's looking through your eyes and staring at the wall or the screen right now, right? And you're like, oh yeah, no, I'm really more so that. And it's like, well, technically, you were so in your head knowing yourself as a past thing or a future possibility, and now you're paying more attention with your eyes and your ears. But technically, while it's better to use your eyes and ears a lot because that's mentally clearer and good and Buddhistic, technically you're any self you are at any time. So you could be a better or worse self, or you could go over here or over there. But you're whatever your mind and body and everything and all your experience is. Remember, this is said mind, not necessarily two or one. So you are definitely any of these things, which means it's very much in the text because he says, no, just in the same way when you're like, no, I'm my past self as I remember it right now, although it doesn't there's ways where they're going to get into different types of imagination or levels of thought, and that in other texts, no, you are your past imaginary self. And then you are this person looking right at me and talking to me. You just flash back and forth between the two, and you are both, because that's what people are in their heads, minds, bodies, world. That's how all of that works mentally, physically. And notice they have specifically called out the mind and the body as different components of the same thing. So they are thinking about the dreaming mind versus the physical body that is simply objective versus the subjective or mental and physical and what have you. There are various ways of interpreting this, of course, but I do think that is a justified interpretation of it, that the Buddha is, as Kalupahana would say, decently a pragmatist, and he is trying to explain how you are whatever you are, no matter if there's different modes of you being that. You are enacting yourself any way you enact yourself. It is similar in a sense to something like Judith Butler, who says, following Nietzsche and Heidegger and Foucault and others, Derrida and others, is that gender is performance. So if wearing a kilt is masculine, if crying, if you are Mormon or Mexican and masculine because it is just so terrible, if that's masculine behavior, then that's what being a man is. And you can say, no, it isn't simply in the mind. It's like, well, tears aren't simply in the mind. Kilts aren't simply in the mind. Sometimes sometimes I wish they were. Though, yeah, I don't get subjected to kilts often enough that would happen. But, yeah, it's like the world is not simply in your head, but that's not non-subjectivity. If you look at the north side of a mountain, is all that in your head? That's still perspectival and subjective. You're looking at one side of the mountain rather than many. That doesn't mean the mountain is inside your mind. So in this sense, yeah, you have the Buddha basically saying that you are whatever form you are, just like the milk is whatever form it currently is, and it's always milk, but it isn't milk when it's butter. It is and isn't milk when it's butter, and it isn't butter when it's milk, in essence, would be the better answer here. So that is the Potthapada Sutta, and we've taken a decent hour on that. It's actually a short text, but it's a fascinating one. It's a really great dialogue. I am not sure if I will do lectures on any of the other long discourses because I want to move on to Buddhism in India, Buddhism in India and China. I often say India, Greece, and China in that order to talk about philosophy. We need to talk about Buddhism in India and China before we begin doing Taoism and then a bunch of Zen, which will be awesome, especially given this stuff. So I may or may not do another long discourse. I'm going to look over the notes, but I am definitely going to be getting into Buddhism in India, which is fascinating and involves Alexander. And we are going to also be then talking about Buddhism in China as an overview, later Japan, because first we need to do Taoism, which is not Buddhism, and then because we have Taoism and Buddhism, we will be going on to much of Chan in China, which is known to Americans in the Anglophonic world very much, especially after World War II, by its Japanese name, Zen. So much happiness, guys, and I hope you guys are all right. Again, try to figure out your mind-body dualisms in decent, non-dueling ways, or just argue with everybody and then say, I don't know, Buddha may or may not be a jerk. Who knows? Who are you people? So yeah, curds become ghee, butter becomes butter, hate becomes hate, fear leads to hate. Yoda leads to Taoism, and we will talk out all of this in the future as our future imagined selves, which is another form of the self, like Buddha. All right. Good night, America, and good luck.